Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about Napoleon, the latest historical epic from director Ridley Scott. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So I'm a bit late. I'm coming at this movie a bit late. I was traveling, just busy over the Thanksgiving break, so I wasn't able to see this movie right when it released. But this was a movie that as soon as I saw the first trailers for this, I was super intrigued. This is a movie that I've been looking forward to because I like Ridley Scott. I like historical epics, and the trailers just looked very compelling. Because probably there is very few kind of historical figures that have elevated themselves to almost near like mythical status as Napoleon Bonaparte. And kind of based on his track record as a director, Ridley Scott really did seem like a perfect fit to tell this kind of historical drama. But unfortunately, I'm here to say that this movie let me down. I was disappointed by this movie. I just don't think it's a good movie. I think maybe there are some positive elements in this, but kind of much like its depiction of the character of Napoleon itself in the movie, the film itself just sort of comes across as a facade of really kind of outwardly impressive visuals and spectacle that just can't kind of conceal or totally mask just sort of the emptiness underneath the surface. Let me say just sort of right up front, obviously the question with these sort of movies like of historical accuracy is a valid question, but that's beyond the purpose of this review, at least for me when I approach these, although I do like to do some research maybe after the fact. What interests me more is just sort of the story as given, sort of what's the story being told, whether it's true to history or not. And kind of to that end, Ridley Scott, like I said, he's no stranger to directing these sort of historically, this is visually striking epics. And with Napoleon, kind of as expected, everything on screen looks impressive. It is immersive. It does have some visceral, sort of striking action scenes. Unfortunately, where the film starts to stumble and lose its way is just a total lack of sort of narrative cohesion. Events in this film kind of happen kind of sequentially, like some sort of historical checklist, sort of jumping from one event to the next. But Scott's just never able to weave those isolated kind of moments into any kind of just compelling unified story. And there's like title cards that will appear kind of to signify the date and the name of sort of these important events in the history of Napoleon and France. But it often, at least to me, felt like the more interesting developments that are happening are actually happening like between these significant events. And it's almost sort of jarring as you skip over a lot of things that are happening, growth, changes, just to make sure you sort of hit all these important kind of landmarks. And another area where this film, I think, just really struggles is just in exploring Napoleon as an interesting case study. Joaquin Phoenix obviously is an exceptional actor. He's more than capable of pulling off a role like this. And whether the fault is with his acting choices or with the script, his performance just comes across extremely one note and just lacks sort of the expected magnetism that you would expect from him portraying such a meaty role like Napoleon. And it's hard to imagine a more unfavorable depiction of Napoleon than this film. He very much comes across as just almost a caricature of just sort of this repressed, kind of immature man-child. And again, the historical Napoleon may well have been such a man. I don't necessarily think this film had to depict him as just some noble, perfect warrior by any means. But the problem with this film is that it never sort of juxtaposes that unfavorable depiction of him with sort of the more well-known, larger-than-life kind of public persona, or kind of do any kind of interesting contrast between those things. There's almost a stubborn refusal to ever depict Napoleon in any kind of hint of a positive life. It sort of glosses over his famous achievements in order to almost revel in his own personal failures and ineptitude. Like his ascension to become emperor of France is almost glossed over to kind of quickly get him back into the bedroom and with his wife and kind of demonstrate his impotence with sexually and his failures. And it results in just Napoleon being a very unsympathetic character, uncompelling character, to the point that when troops at the end of this film kind of rally back to his side, as a viewer, you're almost wondering why the character has shown such little charisma, you've seen such little of his success on the battlefield to kind of warrant that response from these soldiers. And I do think the approach to sort of deconstruct Napoleon is valid. There is an interesting story to do that, to contrast it. It's just that only, I think, is effective if you contrast it against the personal persona that you're trying to deconstruct. But because this film refuses to do that, this becomes a very monotonously repetitive sort of 2.5 hour runtime of just dwelling on this miserable and sad man. Really, all throughout this film, it divides its focus between sort of two contrasting conflicts. There's the literal battlefield of France against its enemies, and then there's the more metaphorical battleground kind of domestically between Napoleon and his toxic and complicated relationship with his wife, Josephine. And largely that relational conflict tends to take center stage. Like there's more scenes probably of kind of Napoleon's sort of unsuccessful, unsatisfying sexual encounters than there are with his like victorious moments on the battlefront. And kind of for some of those sexual things, we'll get to that in just a second with the content. But kind of regarding the literal battleground, again, Ridley Scott clearly knows how to direct a compelling historical battle scene. And I do think when Napoleon is at its best, when it's just delivering kind of spectacle and kind of the period piece aesthetics, the action in this is intense. The scope of it is kind of dazzling. It's this massive scope. And kind of in those moments, this film is working. It is interesting. The problem, though, is that kind of by the time you get, especially to like the end, like the Battle of Waterloo, the famous battle, there is such a disconnect as an audience member from the action that's happening, because you're given no reason to be invested in Napoleon's journey and Napoleon as a character, and because there's no established characters like on the other side of the conflict, the whole thing just comes across very empty. It's this very hollow spectacle. And again, perhaps that's the point. Perhaps that's what this film is going for, to kind of demystify the man, demystify the events, and this exposed the empty futility of sort of selfish male vanity. Maybe that's the point, but kind of either way, it just doesn't result in a very exciting finish to this film, kind of exciting action, despite how kind of visually impressive the spectacle is. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this film, there is quite a bit. Language is probably the least of the content. As I counted maybe 3 to 4 F-bombs, which all actually occur, I think, in the same bit of dialogue, as well as just a handful, 2, 3 other kind of minor profanities. A couple of vulgar words like slut or piss get used. And then there is one exclamation of like JC, as a character says. So that there is language, but maybe not quite as much as you might expect from like an R-rated film. Violence, there is a lot of violence. Like, we don't have time to get into going through each moment of that. But there is, especially in the action scenes, like the battlefield scenes, it can be graphic. Characters are killed with bullets and cannon fire and swords and stabbed with bayonets. And these characters are shown like bloody, and several of them are shown later like missing limbs and stuff on the battlefield. So it can get quite visceral with the violence, although not, I don't think, over the top with the gore, but there definitely is a lot of blood and carnage with that. There's a scene for animal lovers out there. A horse kind of gets gored with a cannonball and kind of opens up its chest, and then later the rider comes back and like reaches into that cavity to retrieve the cannonball. The opening scene in this movie features an execution with the guillotine, and where the woman's head is cut off, and then that sort of severed head is like lifted up in the air, and there is sort of like gore and things coming out from the neck. So that is obviously intentionally shocking. Kind of another surprisingly violent scene is a character attempts to commit suicide by shooting himself in the neck, but he is unsuccessful. And kind of while laying on the ground, like another character puts his finger in the wound. So definitely there is violence in this film, kind of all throughout. As far as sexuality goes, there's a lot here too, probably more than you might be expecting. There are several sort of graphic sex scenes, although the characters aren't, for the most part, aren't like nude in these, but the scenes themselves are graphic, and kind of these include, there's at least 2 scenes where a man is like, thrusting from behind his wife, although they're both clothed at the time. There is another one where the characters are nude, although the woman is sort of covered up in the background, and you do see the male, naked from, or at least partially naked from behind. There's another moment where I think maybe a woman's breast might partially get uncovered, kind of briefly. He wasn't sure about that, but there's that as well. Another scene, a woman kind of pulls up her skirt, spreads her legs to expose herself to a man, although as the audience, you don't actually see beneath the skirt, but that is there as well. There's a stage play that's performed in this, kind of in the background, that's recreating that opening scene with the guillotine. And so they're using like props. It's not a real person, but the actors do hold this sort of prop of a severed head, and they hold it to their like crotch area, and they're kind of vulgarly kind of thrusting against it. There's also just several other scenes sort of implied sexual encounters and scenes, like a man sort of to determine whether him or his wife is sort of responsible for their inability to conceive a child. The man is encouraged to go sleep with sort of this unknown 18-year-old lady, which he does, although you don't actually see that act. And there's also later he expresses interest in perhaps marrying this woman who is later revealed to only be 15 years old, although he sort of refers to that as just a detail. So again, you don't see any of the sexual encounters of those moments on scene, but the implications of that are a lot. As far as kind of things going on beneath the surface themes, some worldview stuff, I think one of the main themes in just is this sort of power and dominance. And I think specifically in terms of like masculinity and kind of how that how that looks, and sort of deconstructing some of that, which again, he's no stranger to that. Ridley Scott, he did that in some of his other recent films, and in this one at least he's trying to, with those sort of two contrasting focuses of like the battlefield at the war, and then there's like sort of the situation at home. He's trying to juxtapose sort of the bravado, the persona of Napoleon out on the battlefield with kind of the pathetic and more emotionally stunted man that he is in his domestic life. And Napoleon, very much in this, he's driven by just seeing the entire world through the lens of like conquest and dominating, and kind of driven to dominate both of those spheres. Because there's an interesting scene where Napoleon is sort of holding his child for the first time, and as he does so, you hear some sort of faint kind of wartime noises and sounds and cannon fire like in the background. And it does seem to be implying, kind of just amplifying the fact that to him, this beautiful moment of new life, this kind of domestic bliss, is still very much to him a moment of conquest and dominance. Kind of at the end of this film, kind of concerning his own military greatness, Napoleon says, "It's just geometry. I know precisely where to place a cannon." Kind of because of those tactical skills, he is honored and he's revered, as a sort of national hero, despite the fact that the film very clearly wants audiences to know what like a failure of a person he was, like in his home life. And obviously the theme of like toxic masculinity can be a hot topic thing. I think it can often veer towards directions that Christians just don't want to go, and there's different ways you can approach that with this. I think there is a very intentional effort to sort of demasculate this hero and present him as this sort of, almost like I said, a caricature of this sort of repressed man-child. But I do think maybe in a more positive sense, despite the fact that this message is fairly simplistic in how it's depicted, I do think it does raise some questions just about kind of why are we infatuated with this sort of outward external power and sort of this masculine spirit to dominate and conquest, rather than kind of more of what would be like a healthy biblical masculinity. And I think also kind of similar to that is just sort of our willingness to overlook sort of the failures and the issues sort of in the home life, because of the greatness of sort of the more external victories and some of that. So I do think as a Christian there are things to kind of think through with that as well. So in the end, Napoleon the man may have been a tactical genius, but Napoleon the film, this demonstrates very little ability to conquer audiences. I think this a disjointed narrative, and just the decision to relentlessly present its title character in just such a negative and I think simplistic way, just add up to be a fairly disappointing film that just doesn't do justice to one of what I think is history's most sort of intriguing and fascinating characters. I was definitely hoping for more than this movie had to to offer. But hey, if you guys have seen this movie, let me know what you think. Did you enjoy this perspective on Napoleon and kind of deconstructing the public persona, or like me, were you hoping for a little bit more of an interesting contrast and kind of exploration of sort of who he was? Would love to hear your thoughts, so jump in the comment section and let me know. If you haven't done so, I encourage you guys, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider, and we got movie reviews and podcasts and just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe. We'll continue to collide with your world for Christ.